So my name's Alison Laxton. I'm joining you today as your host. I'm an attorney and the legal officer for Regenesis, and I'm also the CEO of the School of Law. I'm joined by a very exciting and esteemed group of panelists today. I'll be co-hosting with Advocate Kevin Malunga, the former Deputy Public Protector and the academic head of the Regenesis School of Law. So I'd just like to do some brief introductions to our panelists today who will be joining us. We've got fantastic panelists joining us from Worksmans. We've got Jacques van Wyk, he's a director at Worksmans and holds over 25 years experience in the employment law sphere. He's also assisted various clients with important employment law litigation and has dealt extensively with employment law compliance audits, due diligence investigations, and occupational health and safety compliance audits. So welcome to you, Jacques. Thank you for joining us today. Jacques is joined by Michiel Haynes from Worksmans. He is a senior associate who also specializes in employment practice. His areas of speciality include employment litigation and dispute resolution, as well as giving commercial employment and labor law advice. He's also got extensive experience in legal drafting, occupational health and safety, and forensic audits and investigations. Michiel studied at Stellenbosch University, where he obtained a BA Law, BA Honours, and MA LLB. So welcome, Michiel. Thank you for joining us. And last but not least, we have the Chief of Staff from the African Transformation Movement, Molisi Makubo. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to welcome all of our panelists on board. We hope that you have a fantastic webinar with us today if you are joining as an attendee. These webinars are recorded for those who wish to join us later on and re-watch the webinar series that we host for the Regenesis Law School. So I'm going to hand over to our panelists from Worksmans, to Jacques and Michiel. And they've written a fantastic article very recently on how load shedding has really changed the landscape in which we are working with employees and industries. So I'm just going to hand over to them to give you some insight into what they've observed and some of the changes that we've witnessed as a result of the ongoing load shedding within South Africa.
Thanks, Alison. And greetings to all panelists and those who are joining the webinar. It's a privilege to be part of this process. We published an article in response to ongoing advice which was being sought by our clients in regard to how they should respond to load shedding and the impact it has on business. So typically, one would have a business that, for instance, doesn't have a generator or doesn't have solar power and inverters, etc., and has to shut down on an ongoing intermittent basis. The question then arises, well, what do we do with the employees? So we looked at the law and we concluded that as the law is currently, and in most sectors, and we'll deal with those sectors which we regard as exceptional, in most sectors, if the employee arrives at work and tenders his or her services and the power goes off, the employee is not denied their right to remuneration. They need only tender their services in order to be entitled to remuneration. So that's the sort of the legal position as we see it. What we have noticed, though, and I think this is really the challenge. The challenge is, and what is interesting is, well, what about the law in relation to that? What about the Basic Conditions of Employment Act? What about the Labour Relations Act? What are our rights as employers or employees in those circumstances? And I think that the difficulty we have is the following. We have a legal framework which consists of a whole range of labor legislation, such as the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Labour Relations Act, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and such, that sets a framework within which an employer and employee interact with each other. Uh, the law of contract also is part of that framework. Bargaining council agreements and main agreements also form part of that framework within which these two parties interact. And so one must consider this problem within that framework. But what is apparent is that on the whole, our statutes do not contemplate a situation such as we have now with load shedding. So the framework within which this relationship is positioned contemplates a 5 or 6 day working week, starting at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning and ending at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon if you're not a shift worker. If you're a shift worker, it contemplates you working a day or night shift no longer than 12 hours or no more than 3 and a few days a week. It contemplates you're not working on a Sunday unless you agree to it, and if you do, you get paid a premium, and the same in regard to public holidays. It also contemplates being paid overtime if you work outside your ordinary agreed hours or regulated hours. So this is the framework within which we find ourselves. The problem is that the reality that we have doesn't match. So we don't have constant power allowing us, in many cases, to run a business from 9 to 5, 5 days a week or 6 days a week. So there's a little bit of a there's a well not a little bit, there's a significant lag or gap between the statute and the legal framework within which we find ourselves and the reality within which employers and employees find themselves. Then added to that, we also have the notion of the common law, which applies to this relationship. So it's a contract ultimately between an employer and employee, and one can't unilaterally change terms and conditions of employment. That's a old, well accepted contractual legal principle. When it comes to material terms and conditions, one party cannot unilaterally change a reciprocal agreement, such as what the employment law is. So that's another constraint on dealing with load shedding. And then, of course, there are bargaining council agreements, which add a different layer, another layer of complexity, with their own bespoke terms and conditions of employment within the framework of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and so on. So, which also will obviously not unilaterally be changed. So that's the context within which we considered this problem. So as a start, that's where we are, Alison.
Thank you, Jacques. And I think that that is such an incredible and an important thing to note is that we have talks around, is this a state of disaster? And does that even apply in a self-imposed state of disaster where, the load shedding is a controlled limitation of electricity to various areas across the country? And how do we interpret employment contracts? How do we have to change the law now in a way that we preserve jobs and we preserve the economic need to create employment in the country whilst ensuring that employers can also meet the needs of their suppliers? So we've seen a massive ripple effect and a massive change in perspective as to how we work. And, this is also becoming something that is asked in interviews. People are being asked, if you work a hybrid or remote role, do you even have an inverter? Do you have provision for load shedding? Because if you can't work that 9 to 5, how does that employer deal with it? And I think Jacques and Michiel have touched on such an important aspect of how we have to change our thinking around the employment laws going forward. It's clear that load shedding is probably here to stay, and we will get into what we can discuss around how it could possibly be resolved or what mitigating effects we would look at. But this is something that is here to stay. So I'm now just going to hand over to Michiel if you would like to add to what Jacques has discussed and perhaps touch on some other points that we are struggling with in industry and that we've seen affect the economy as a whole within South Africa.
Thanks, Alison. Yes, I think that's such an important point. I think at the moment we're at a juncture where load shedding isn't unforeseen. It's pre-scheduled. On a Sunday, we all get a schedule for next week's load shedding. So we've moved from this unexpected environment where it's actually pre-scheduled, planned, and that's a very important dynamic as well. It brings another factor into consideration. So employers are actually, to a certain extent, able to plan the work week, and that provides some mechanisms where you can say, all right, so for the next week, it's most likely that we'll be able to work on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, but not on Friday, and plan around that. So I think that's a very important thing that we'll see going forward, is that we'll need to almost live with this new normal. Um, um, and all indications are that it's going to be for the next 3, 4, 5 years at least. So I think, to add on to what Jacques said, we'll have to see some developments in that regard. And we've seen very few regulations published in terms of the Disaster Management Act. But as with COVID and the pandemic, we think we might see more of those, and see, maybe employers need to do a risk assessment in the workplace and see whether their industry is perhaps more high risk. If it's a factory and suddenly the power goes out, we expect to see more of those.
Thank you very much, Michiel. And that is so true. And not just, how we have to adapt and do these risk assessments as employers, but factoring in your budgeting. There's been a lot of talk around the economic cost of keeping your business up and running whilst load shedding hits you. And some estimating that it's costing them hundreds of thousands additional, input from their companies just to run things like generators or to install permanent solutions such as solar power. And this is something that's becoming a norm. Almost everyone in South Africa is starting to save up and incur a cost for having a UPS or an inverter in their family home. And we struggle to make our deadlines on time, to get to work on time, simply because load shedding will affect the robots, it will affect traffic, and we're seeing an entirely different landscape. So there's been this interesting development around COVID-19 and how we worked then, and going online and physically not being able to go into the office. And we are starting to see those effects also impacting us, but from a load shedding perspective, now that the pandemic has started to subside. So some very interesting takeaway points there for any employers and possibly employees affected by load shedding from our panelists from Worksmans. So Mlolisi, I'm going to hand over to you just to chat to us a little bit about what you've perhaps been observing as somebody who's a member of a political party, and what the relevant changes might be as to what you think we can do to address these massive issues that we've seen, resulting in economic losses and job losses as well.
Thank you so very much, Alison. I think the most important part to note, especially taking from Jacques and his contribution, is that we are a developing country, and that then leads us to be able to focus on the acceleration of many economic spheres that are going to give us a healthy economy, so to say. And looking at the fact that load shedding on its own poses a strong risk, or a high risk, on the acceleration of fourth industrial revolution projects, and that also now affect other multi-tier segments such as your agriculture, such as your education, your health, and so forth. It's actually quite difficult to find ourselves navigating throughout, because it is a proven fact that in the year 2022 alone, we had over 200 days of load shedding. And if you actually look at that, we are operating just below 50%. And with an ailing economy such as ours, it's actually quite difficult to be able to give, the birth to anything that is that is going to give us sound traction towards finding ourselves being in the correct side of actually being healthy as far as the economy is concerned. I think we've talked about many businesses being shut down, but the effects load shedding actually has on SMEs. We as the African Transformation Movement published an article where we actually observed the number of economies that are growing that had SMEs actually being sound contributors towards the growth of the gross domestic products of all of those countries. And with SMEs having little to no resources whatsoever, it's actually quite difficult for them to keep their doors open, and it affects so much more than just jobs. It affects the principles of supply and demand. It affects the principles of bargaining power, buying power by those businesses. They're unable to operate at an optimum level. So it is actually quite a concern, and we actually need to maybe zoom into the fact that I think Chuck also touched on it, that the owners, as per common law and many other supporting legislation, the onus lies with local municipalities to provide electricity. And as we've seen in recent articles, the president actually alluded to the fact that he does not have a legal obligation to provide electricity. But in actual truth, that is not correct, because we look at government not as separate entities. Even though you've got three tiers of government, which is now your national government, your provincial government, as well as your lower level government, inclusive of your local government, your district municipalities, your cities, such as your metros and whatnot. They all report to a specific line of march. So you can't necessarily say that we are taking away the responsibility or the duty to provide electricity as a basic need for South Africans, because it has gone over to being just a privilege, but a basic need for us to be able to move over to being a developed country. And you look at the fact that the multi-tier government segments report to certain boards, such as your Municipal Demarcation Board, your South African Local Government Association, which is your SALGA, as well as the CITES network. And all of those people report to the COPTA ministry. And the COPTA ministry is deployed by the president. You look at that and you actually think as to who exactly is responsible to answer for the electricity issue that we've got in South Africa, and it all ends up with the president. And we cannot take away the fact that there is an interministerial committee that has been set up, which now comprises of your electricity ministry, which comprises of your COPTA ministry, your Minister of Public Enterprises, as well as the minister in the mineral resources space. All of those ministers are actually responsible collectively for the provision of electricity in the country, and we cannot also take away the fact that they form part of an executive. So as a people, and as people that are both in the private sector as well as the public sector, it is our duty then to be able to hold all of those people accountable. Because we cannot only say that, okay, one of the mines is providing coal that is of a substandard role. Why are we not giving the specifications in time to the suppliers of coal so that we're able to generate coal? And this idea that the departure from our coal-based supply of energy towards a green energy is actually going to be our solution. Are we actually at a capacity as South Africa to drastically move towards that? Because we've seen the president taking numerous loans from numerous parts of the world, to numerous parts of the end of the world, to actually accelerate green energy projects. But are we at a point where we can be able to say that we are going to be sustainable if we do that? That's why we are saying as the African Transformation Movement, we might as well just adopt a dual, mechanism. where we are running on a parallel basis, because honestly speaking, coal is one of our strongest commodities in South Africa. That is why we are able to export it to many parts of the country. And that then means if it's part of our strongest commodities, why can't we use it for ourselves? And in the same instance, while we are then rolling out and managing change that is coming about in the country, then we are able to then reintroduce or introduce green projects that are going to then give us sustainable electricity. So there is no competition between these two strategies. We can actually employ them at the same time without rushing. But what we are seeing in our government, in the sixth administration, which is now Mr. Ramaphosa's administration, there is a rushed and a hushed a way of working as far as the green energy projects are concerned. And that is where we are going to get it wrong, because so many jobs are going to be lost. Number one, that is not going to assist us in anything. Number two, as we are merging over to the new electricity way or way of getting electricity, what are we abandoning in the process? Are we then going to be shutting down our coal mines? How is that going to affect the economy that we already have? How is that going to affect the existing power plants that we have? So those are the conversations that we are perhaps maybe going to explore as we go through this discussion. I'd like to park it there for now. Thank you very much, Alice.
Thank you very, very much for those insightful points. And, you know, there really is some valuable things that we can take away from that. And, you know, we understand that the problem itself is extremely complex and has to be unpacked not only by those who are involved in government and in the public sector, but also unpacked and you know, there must be interest by private stakeholders. And we've seen a massive shift from people relying on, you know, government sources of electricity to their own private, you know, sources of electricity. So people going to great lengths to collaborate and get off the grid, so to speak. And I think, Lolisi, you made a very important point there about green energy. And it's really been the next step that we have to take, and that a lot of countries globally are starting to take, not just from an environmental perspective, but also from a sustainability perspective, and ensuring that we have a parallel system that runs in conjunction with our traditional supply to try and meet the needs of the demand throughout the country for electricity. And one thing I will say is that South Africans, as much as we may require processes and require things to be put in place, we are good at collaborating, and we are truly the spirit of Ubuntu. And I think that we need to embody this spirit when trying to solve this problem as a nation, is not only seeing, you know, what can you do in your sector and how can you drive change. There's this shift and this mindset shift that we've seen with load shedding, from citizens who feel powerless to citizens who start to act for change, who become more active in their public participation, who start to put their hands up and say, but we want to propose a solution. We want to make sure that South Africa can move forward. And I think that that is one of the most important things when addressing this load shedding issue, is let us not be complacent and think, well, it's somebody else's job. Let's use the rules and regulations and legislation that's in place to empower us, but let's also take active steps where we can to engage the industry leaders, to engage your local politicians, to engage your fellow citizens, and to see how do we move forward and how do we save our country from this massive impact that load shedding has been having. So I'm now just going to hand over to Advocate Kevin Malunga. I'm not sure if you'd like to add some of your thoughts on the topic, and maybe if you want to talk about the public sphere and some of the changes you've also observed there.
Okay, thanks, Alison. First and foremost, as co-host of this event, I just want to heartily welcome all our participants. As you can see, this is a very high-powered panel. You know, Worksmans is no Mickey Mouse firm. You know, this is a firm that has been in the trenches of legal practice for a very long time and has the highest quality. And of course, we know ATM is stirring left, right, and center. So we are really as impartial and as vast an organization as possible. The point we're making is that everybody is our stakeholder, right? Every member of the public is our stakeholder, and of course, the experts that are here today are highly appreciated. And that said, I have a history in this matter, as Alison indicated, that I was deputy public protector under Thuli Madonsela for a significant period, and part of the investigations we did were investigations of ESCOM, you know. And what is interesting is that I saw a little, you can find it today. There's a little thing that came out today, this morning. Well, I'm sure it's been around, but I only saw it this morning. A little one-page flyer that ESCOM is putting out on why we are load shedding, right? And here are their reasons. It's a nice little graphic, eh? I'll give it top marks for graphics, but definitely very low marks for truth. So it says, causes of load shedding, poor supply handling issues at power stations, shortage and depletion of fuel, failures of units at power stations, demand prediction errors, weather-related issues, and then it puts supply import issues. And then at the top it explains what is load shedding, etc. But there's nothing about governance, acknowledging corruption in public procurement of the same coal and other factors, appointing the wrong people to run the entity, the state capture, of course, project, so many things that obviously one encountered over the years, which are literally just left parked aside. So as long as there's a failure to acknowledge the real problems, you know, the problem, things will just go worse. You know, if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, Ms. Laxton, I think you're drinking too much, you know, this is why you're having this problem, this or that other health problem. And then when you go to your family, you say, no, I think, you know, it's just the air, you know, the air that I'm breathing, you know, or you blame the doctor, right? That's not solving the problem. So I think that's the dynamic that is happening. And sadly, I think, in my subjective view, the civil societies, and I want to put them on the spot, because sometimes one of these days they'll also have to come in. I think they've been fairly lackadaisical in this process, because they need to stir. And Mr. Makubu as well, you, as the various political players, you need to stir this pot to say, look, we think that you are failing us as citizens. Remember, South Africa, I'm holding this up. The Constitution is one of the most progressive in the world. And it has socioeconomic rights, quite robustly so. And I would say the right to energy is probably, you can interpret that Constitution to include the right to energy, because especially with the amount of tax that you pay, etc. You know, there is enough to certainly go around. So my sense has always been that South Africa, with this sparkling infrastructure and its advanced history, shouldn't be having these type of third world problems, right? Many people, I mean, I studied overseas, and some of my friends who come here are always surprised that a country with all this level of advancement still can't keep on the lights. You know, they're always very surprised by that. So, and I always say, so I'll put the blame squarely on failure to acknowledge the real source of the problem, which is mismanagement, misrule, misgovernance, appointing the wrong people. Public procurement is probably South Africa's biggest headache. You have seen how the wrong people have been getting contracts for a lot of things. So that's why we have potholes, for example. It's not so much of the fact that there is no money. You just have people who just don't want to take these things seriously. The city of Johannesburg, which I live in, is sort of like a revolving door of administrations, and I would suspect that service delivery has long ceased to be a priority among the people who are getting appointed. They really just want the positions, and the positions are a way of dispensing patronage, and that's the sad part. And that said, I'll also then blame, with a certain level of sensitivity, because it's not really their fault, the public. Because now what then happens is the public in these dynamics where state-owned enterprises fail to deliver services, the public then vote with their feet on many things. The panel sitting here probably doesn't use public health care, right? Because they don't trust public health care. They go to public hospitals. Now, in the complex that I live in, we have private security guards. Instead of trusting the state with your security, people send their children to private schools because increasingly sometimes they don't have complete faith in the state system. So, and that shouldn't be, that should not be the case. And I could keep going. People have medical aid, etc. I could keep going in terms of how this is, you see people cutting their own grass in certain localities, right? Instead of that being a municipal function, they're not supposed to be doing that, right? The list goes on and on and on and on and on. And so, which is why I think we need a more vigilant and aggressive public that asserts their rights to say, look, come on, we can't be fleeced, paying this much tax every year, yet we we are having to foot the bill for our own things. And of course, load shedding has increased the level of crime. I was talking about my own mugging last week at a food outlet just after load shedding started, and of course the lights turned on. But then in many complexes, people come through being robbed in the dark at night. So there's so many problems associated with this. And I think I'm comfortable enough as a sort of like independent institution that is out there to produce cutting edge lawyers and people who are objective and ethical to somewhat lay the truth as it is right now and say, look, then how do stakeholders handle this? And of course, as a last point, Alison, I've spoken too much. The real issue is that these webinars are going to be touching these practical, real life issues that will change the trajectory of people's personal life and the general lives of the public for the better. So this is the context, of course, and to say whatever you want. If you're not comfortable with something,
Advocate Kevin, and I think you touched on some very important points. And notorious the point where if you go to where hardware stores, there are pothole kits that the private sector is selling to members of the public to fix their own potholes. And it is becoming a huge opportunity for the guys in the public sector to make a lot of money, but we are failing to use the mechanisms in place to ensure that we are getting the service delivery that should be provided by the state. And I think that there's got to be a large awareness campaign, perhaps, around what mechanisms are available. We have such a beautiful constitution. It's so brilliantly drafted. And yet, if you ask a layperson on the street, do they know their rights? They don't. People are not familiar with the avenues available to them to have their rights enforced and to have their rights heard and to have platforms upon which they can voice those concerns. So whilst we are incredibly good in South Africa at engaging and collaborating in communities, which is something that we often see, is that spirit of Ubuntu, that spirit of having that community that raises the child, a village raises a child. We are losing that connection between the citizen and the state. And there's going to have to be a serious approach and a radical approach to how we engage government in a way that doesn't destroy more of what we have. So unfortunately, we're sitting in a position now where the public's trust in the government has eroded. And we need to foster that trust again. We need to make sure that there is open and transparent and collaborative communication between our members of the public, between the various stakeholders that represent and fight for those rights, and also the government themselves, to say, maybe we didn't inherit a perfect system, or we haven't made the best choices, but how do we work as a country to fix the problems that currently exist? And it's so easy as an individual and as an organization, or even as a country, to get into this habit of a name, shame, blame, and to lose that everyone to some extent has a part to play. And I like to think of it as no one person is powerless. And we've developed that mindset that I'm just one person. What can I honestly do to change something as significant and widespread as load shedding? And we've forgotten how powerful, historically, small groups of very tightly interconnected citizens can make change. We've forgotten about our roots and how we are able to effect change. And not only that, but effect change in a way that's collaborative and has a good outcome for everyone. I mean, we think of 1994 and how the country was on a knife's edge politically, and how we develop mechanisms in place for truth and reconciliation to develop a country where we wanted to move to being a united democracy. And let us not forget that that's where we come from, and that's how we should be facing our challenges. So it's not to become, animalistic and vicious and name, shame, and blame. It's to say, how can I, as a citizen, connect with those in my community who will take on the challenges we are facing and engage the correct public organizations or private organizations or political parties, or it could be nonprofit organizations, to enforce and make sure that our rights are heard. And it's so important that we realize that every single person in South Africa is being affected by load shedding. Every single business owner is being affected by load shedding, if not directly, indirectly. This is something that affects every single one of us. And so it's up to you to also ask, what can I do? What steps can I take? And how can we affect this change? So we've spoken about the sort of public sector and the mechanisms that have been lacking there, the lack of regulations that have come in, the lack of provisions in legislation that exists to assist in specifically the employment sector. And then we've also spoken a bit about public participation. So I'm now just going to hand over to my panel for those who want to contribute. What are some of your suggestions in your respective industries on how can people start engaging more, and what steps should they be taking to ensure that we are proactively addressing this load shedding issue and how it's impacting them?
Maybe if I can jump in immediately, Alison. So what we looked at, Michiel and I and my firm, was what is there for an employer to do? How can an employer adapt, an employee adapt their circumstances to respond to this intermittent loss of power? So thankfully, there are some ways forward. So, as you say, we should focus on the positive. What can we do individually and as a group to work our way through this challenge and to keep the business going? Because without the business, there's no employment. And that is a disaster. That would be a total disaster. It would make load shedding far worse, the consequences worse. So thankfully, we have something called part-time employment. So the employer and employee can reach an agreement to change the contracts of employment from the, let's call it, pre-load shedding default position to something that's more flexible, that allows the parties to respond and to react to loss of unforeseen load shedding. So you might agree to reduce the hours on a daily basis, or to only pay for work done, or to pay a flat fee. So, for instance, 4 hours a day, even if we only work for 3 on the one day, maybe 6 on the next day. An agreement to be more flexible on when work starts and finishes. So that agreement would then affect when overtime starts and finishes. A willingness to swap out days, for instance, to make up a lost day and employment. So within the law of contract, within the realms of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, there is some flexibility, and that should be explored to the maximum. It does not necessarily go all the way, and that's the fact. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act wasn't drafted when there was load shedding. It didn't contemplate load shedding, nor did the Labour Relations Act. Of course, worst case scenario, employers can engage with their trade unions or with their employees about restructuring the business, and unfortunately, sometimes that may lead to job losses. But there's a balancing that takes place in that case, and the employer has to decide: do I run the risk of going bankrupt and every single one of my employees loses their employment, or do I make cuts, maybe changing working hours and so on, going on to short time to keep the business going until things get better, so that I can preserve employment? So that's another option. Michiel will add that there's a particular bargaining council, the Metal Engineering Industries Bargaining Council, has some unusual provisions. Do you want to deal with it, Michiel?
Yeah, so I think Alison and Advocate Malunga, both of you emphasized that a collaborative approach is very important. The positive way of looking at this very disastrous situation is to kind of try and work together. And the one example we do have is in the metal and engineering industry, where they actually provide for positive measures to alleviate some of the pressures, where short time can be instituted, in particular if the power supply goes out. At the same time, also balancing the employees' rights to at least 4 hours of pay in the event that they are being sent home. So I do agree with both of you that might be a very a pragmatic way of looking at it, that we try and move forward in a collaborative way and get the buy-in of all stakeholders to alleviate the pressures and make businesses survive.
Thank you very much. And I think some very important points have been made there. Is how do you strike that extremely fine balance when there are competing interests, but ultimately you have to keep businesses afloat? And I think that there has to be a collaborative approach, there has to be a reasonable approach, and also a bigger picture approach where we don't focus too much on the finer details, but the long-term plan. And the long-term plan in addressing or coping with these load shedding woes is to make sure that we avoid mass retrenchments, we avoid businesses going out of business and liquidating, and we ensure that the economy can continue to function somewhat despite the crippling, massive nationwide effect that this has had, and especially on the industries, like you say, in metal and in those basic production, it's urgent to sort that out, because if we cannot meet basic supply and demand, especially in our industry, it's going to affect our GDP, it's going to affect every single citizen, even those of us who sit in white collar jobs. It has an impact nationwide, and it's going to affect South Africa globally as well in terms of where we are from a financial standpoint. And another thing that's also been raised is South Africa's recent grey listing and how we are losing out economically and becoming a country that is not attractive to investors. And this is sad, because South Africa is actually a beautiful country with so much to offer. We have rich mineral resources. We have a huge amount of tourist opportunities. We have so much to offer the globe, and we have been historically a trading point. If you look at where South Africa was centuries ago, this was truly the trading hub of the globe. And we have the opportunity to continue to be a strong player, not just within the globe, but in Africa specifically. And we need to make sure that we can continue to play that role, which load shedding has been impacting. Excuse me. So, Mondisi, I just want to hand over to you maybe to give us, from a political party's perspective, how do you think we can encourage public participation, and what are certain measures that you've seen working for citizens affected or business owners affected? Like you say, SMMEs are super affected by load shedding. And when we talk about SMMEs, we talk about people who are usually sole proprietors. They have very limited capacity and capital to start a business. If they hire people, they start off small. And these are people who can't afford to install massive generator systems. So, Molisi, if you just want to give us a bit of feedback as to what you've witnessed and what you'd encourage from a public participation sphere.
Thank you very much, Alison. I think before I even get into that, you mentioned something quite interesting, and that is quite unfortunate for us. The grey listing of South Africa, which is not assisting us in anything that we're trying to achieve as far as moving away from, being listed in the grey zone, especially looking at the fact that load shedding on its own poses a number of challenges to the country. That is where now people, instead of doing things the correct way, they resort to illicit financial flows that then further put us in the grey as far as our internal controls, as far as our finances are concerned. And that is where now you start seeing the bleed of bad business coming into the picture, where we don't even have control over what is happening in the country. And that is why perhaps maybe we also need to examine the current state of national disaster that we're in. If we say that we need to then move over to being sound providers of electricity for this country, the most important, I'd like to say maybe provision that President Vuyelo Zungula always instills in all of the public officials of the African Transformation Movement is this: you need to always operate from a position of strength. We are a country that is rich in minerals. We are a country that is rich in so many other issues. In so many other commodities. Why are we not then strengthening the provision of all of those commodities so that we are able to export and perhaps maybe import some of the commodities that we're not as strong in, towards now forging a better global, agreements that are going to then open up trade, that will then give us much more as far as companies in the SME sector are concerned. Then we know that we are then redistributing all of those channels, the supply chain, towards then all of these businesses being sound providers, to not only their employees, but towards the GDP of the country. So it means that we need to start increasing our buying power and our supply and demand as far as the global markets are concerned. Because as it stands right now in South Africa, I don't think we are going to actually achieve much more because we're already operating at a loss. So it means that if we are to move towards being, let's say, financially healthy or economically healthy, it first starts with us opening up those demand versus supply channels with all of our global counterparts. But that is not going to happen, Alison, unless we actually fix the grey listing. It does not assist us, and at the fear of sounding a bit political, I do apologize if I do to my panel members, but we can't do that if, for instance, the people that have been elected to be public officials are not exemplary in how they behave, in how they conduct themselves. A very, very loud example would be the Phala Phala issue that is actually causing a bit of a rift in the country. So we need to be able to have ethical leadership that will then assist us in reforming how the global markets, how the global world actually looks at us as a country. Then we know that we're not only going to face adverse ratings from rating agencies and grey listing and so forth, but if we are able to move away from being grey listed, then we know that we can be able to start then our journey to recovery. But as far as including communities is concerned, the one thing that we've seen as the African Transformation Movement, as we were busy with our public engagements, is that our people are actually, how can I say, are distant as far as information is concerned. Perhaps it could be a case of how information flows from the state. I'm not going to speak for the private sector. I'm not in the private sector. I believe Mr. Jock is Advocate Jock is there, and Haynes is there. Pardon me for pronouncing the name wrong. But in the public sector, we've seen that information is lagging. There's a lag between, in fact, there's a bit of a rift between how information gets to the public, where even information that is gazetted is not necessarily known by the public. And we need to start using mediums that are closer to the people, mediums that are easier to get to the people, whether it's your community engagement forums, whether it's your social media platforms, whether it's your community networking forums, whether we are trying as both these sectors, which is now the public sector as well as the private sector, to forge or foster a culture of synergy towards now the rolling out of information, so that we know that all of the people are informed. And when it comes to the tabling of strategies, because we cannot just move as one leg, for instance, Advocate Jock, pardon me, Advocate Jock is doing so much beautiful work in the private sector. And how is it then going to incorporate or get incorporated into the communities? That is where then the fostering of a culture, an inclusive culture, needs to start happening between the public sector as well as the private sector, where we actually say that we are getting people into one room, we are getting people into a specific, what do you call, crawl, if we need to do that. But we are on a road show that will give information to people so that people are informed of all of the reforms that we want to actually employ. So as the African Transformation Movement, that is one of the key strategies that we've used in making sure that we reach our audience. We reach the people where they are, because you have to go to the people where they are and be at their level so that they understand the problem. Because even if you can ask any layman person as to how is load shedding affecting, they're just going to say that they can't be able to cook, they can't be able to whatever. But the bigger picture is far from them, because they don't see that if they're not able to have electricity, they're not able to have a job, for instance, they're not able to have proper working hours and so forth and so forth. So we need to be able to educate people enough so that people actually know the effects that are beyond what meets the eye. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you've made some really important points on teaching people at a grassroots level about just how serious the issue is, and not just making them fearful and it's all doom and gloom, but saying, how do we address and empower the citizen to make a change and to feel as if they have that public participation? And for a long time, there has been really this separation between the state and what they do and the citizen on the ground. And that's quite sad, because we're a constitutional democracy. We are meant to be engaging with our government in a way that is free, transformative, open, collaborative. And we had that, I believe, that dream was always there, and it kicked off initially when we came into our new constitutional democracy. And let us not forget that that is who we are, and that's how we should be. We do not have an autocratic government where we have no say in who gets elected or who comes into power. You vote, and by virtue of you having a vote, you have a say. And let us not change that perspective in people's minds. As an individual, please engage with your communities. Go and speak to your ward councillors. There are ward councillors who run Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups and make themselves available to the public. And they are of service to the communities. And let us have that mindset that we are in this together, and we are going to elect public servants who are there to help us solve a problem collaboratively. It is so easy to say, well, that's somebody else's problem. But if it affects you, it is our problem. Collaboratively, collectively, it is our pain point as a country. So start engaging with your political parties, with your ward councillors, with your private sector stakeholders, and saying, what are you guys doing, and how are you getting engaged to effect a change that will benefit South Africa as a whole? Because it's very important to remember how we get to that change will also establish the stability of the solution thereafter. And a change that comes through a lot of unrest that is unproductive is likely to result in an unsustainable solution. Whereas a collaborative, ethical, open and honest engagement will result in a transformation and a solution that is sustainable, because everyone can trust each other, everyone works together, and people know the positions that they have and the power that they hold. So this is something that I want everyone who's listening to this webinar here today to think about, especially if you're a legal practitioner and you are an attorney or an advocate, or you hold some sort of power. Remember that you're in an advantageous position in society right now, in that you hold firstly a university degree, which is a privilege in South Africa. It's a privilege to have been educated through a tertiary institution. It's a privilege to know and be intricate and knowledgeable of our law. And for you to say, yes, I may be a private practitioner, but how can I start engaging in a way that is meaningful and that contributes to the upliftment of society and South Africa? And how can we address this issue as a collaborative? And it starts in small groups. Let us not think because we're a community or a group of 20 people that we can't make a difference. That's the biggest mistake we make, is that we think we're insignificant, but we're not. So Advocate Malunga, I'm not sure if you would like to add anything to those points, and maybe just talk about public participation as well, and what you feel we can take away from this discussion today.
Thanks. I think, as you've correctly pointed out, and participants have diagnosed the problem, this is a very multi-layered conversation. But the responsibility ultimately is firmly at the state's doorstep, because the obligation to provide energy in South Africa is a state function. Whether people may have other ideas, and of course, we are giving the state a lot of leeway to abdicate its responsibilities by doing for it what it's supposed to do. You see, now I always joke that the biggest dinner and cocktail discussion these days is, What type of inverter have you got? What type of UPS have you got? Right? And that's so terrible, because in many ways people are abdicating, giving the state free rein to fail in its obligations. And the other thing which I forgot to mention last time is, there's this old adage, old saying, too many cooks spoil the broth, right? And the energy broth is largely also because of many cooks. I just saw a statement this morning. The Department of Trade and Industry has issued a statement on how it's going to fix load shedding. There's also Department of Energy, which has an its opinion. And of course, at some point, there was the Minister of Energy and the Minister of Public Enterprises were at each other's throats. And now there's also a Minister of Electricity who loves to dance. Well, he probably needs power to dance well in the light, But yeah, and music. So the issue is really that I think there has to be a more mainstreamed and more efficient system. I've done a lot of these benchmarking trips, Alison, to some of the most advanced systems: Singapore, Korea, Hong Kong, the UK, and seen how they do the whole service delivery thing, and they show us how do they deal with state entities that don't deliver. And rest assured, in many of those spaces, you don't have a multiplicity of players doing one thing. And if they are there, they at least has some sort of synchronization. There's a certain element of efficiency. So now currently you have a situation where you're saying, no, I can't fire that political role player because he's a constituency of mine, and so forth. So, and I guess that's just not going to work. And I know the other parties, of course, the law firms can't say anything because you represent all these guys. They'll come to you as clients. So it's okay. I understand that. So it's a business, but the reality from a governance and legal perspective, and we also want law students, those of our law students who are watching, to think, to be open-minded thinkers, to be not to just swallow information that they are given without interrogating it legally and intellectually, because someone listens to a spokesperson lying through their teeth, and that's just gospel, and that's a problem, you see. So and a lying government, we know what a lying government did with Joseph Goebbels, if you did German history, who was Hitler's spokesperson. So you don't want a lying government. You want a government at least that tells the truth when it's having problems, and the public can then hold its hand. But yeah, that's the way I would look at it.
Thank you, Advocate Kevin. And I think that we also have to realize that there has been this erosion of public trust in the state, and we have come out of a really difficult time. We're coming out of a pandemic where we were in a global lockdown, where people actually lost that trust with one another. And we almost have to foster that collaboration that we had prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's almost been a double whammy, because we lost so many businesses over COVID, and we lost so many businesses to those lockdown measures. People who simply could not make a living. And then load shedding came along and worsened and crippled whatever shaky leg we were standing on. And this is now where we find ourselves, is in a very precarious position, unfortunately, where many business owners and industries have been negatively impacted. And we have to think about how do we go forward from here? Because to a lot of people, it feels as if, well, has South Africa hit rock bottom? Have we actually reached the end of the road? And how do we get out of this pit that we feel we find ourselves in? So I think we've discussed some really important points today that, have affected both the private and the public sector. And we've also given you hopefully some topics to think about and take away from this webinar, and to not lose hope. And I think that as something we can all take away is that as a South African and as somebody who still wants to invest in and participate in this country, and who still to a degree loves this country and loves its people, and we have so much that we can really appreciate in this country, how do we make that better? How do we find the Ubuntu that we seem to have lost? And how do we use the measures in place to uphold the rule of law and to give people their basic rights, to make sure that people can actively participate in the economy by being employed, to make sure that they can understand the power that they have as citizens, their right to vote, their right to engage with the state and to hold the state accountable, and also to then engage with the industry experts and stakeholders to say, well, how do we adapt? And this is the most important thing, is how do we adapt and overcome the struggles that are facing us currently? And we had to do it with COVID. We had to change the way in which we worked. I mean, even now we're having an online webinar, and who's to say 5 years ago we would have done that? Probably not. So we have advantages to how we've changed how we work, but that doesn't mean that we can't apply the same thinking that we applied with COVID to load shedding, is whilst we wait and whilst we hold the state responsible for fixing the energy crisis that we currently face, how do we ensure that we adapt and overcome as businesses and make sure that people don't lose their jobs, that the economy isn't further negatively affected? And that's something I want everyone here to think about, and also to think about your role and the role that you can play in whatever job that you hold, whatever profession you want to pursue. And what would you like to contribute to society? And that's something we believe in very firmly at Regenesis, is the holistic development of the individual. And how does that have a ripple effect? And we've seen it, right? Corruption breeds corruption. Negativity breeds negativity. But being open, being honest, being transparent, being proactive as an individual has a ripple effect on your community. It has a ripple effect on your team. What kind of manager are you in your workplace? What kind of business owner are you? Are you collaborative? Are you taking initiative? And are you taking steps to make sure that ultimately we can, as small groups or small clusters of people, business owners, hold the state liable and say, look, we need to change something here. We know that it's come to the time now where it's come to a head. How are we going to fix this as a nation? And the only way, we believe, is to really work collaboratively and aggressively in a collaborative and transformative manner to make this change happen. So if there are any final closing comments from my panel, I'd just like to hand over to them. And thank you to all of our panelists and our attendees who joined us today. We hope that you found this webinar to be insightful and that it will get your cogs turning in your brain as to how do we tackle this very multi-layered and complex problem. So just over to my panel if you'd like to add some closing comments for our guests today.
Alison, sorry, I'll jump in again. Excuse me to my other colleagues. I do think there's flexibility within the legal framework, which will allow employers and employees to find a solution that ultimately saves jobs. That's one of the prime focuses that we have in advising our clients, is to keep on going, keep busy, keep employing, because we would want to avoid that added disaster. Thank you.
I'm not
Lucy,
very
would you like
much
to
sure,
add
Alison.
anything in closing? Sorry,
I
there we
was
go.
actually just about to jump in, but I retained the order of the sequence, but it's perfectly fine. I think the most important mark that I can make in closing is that the load shedding that we currently have is costing us 899 million per day. And that is not even looking at the opportunity costs, because we are running at a lower production rate with higher cost of production as far as all of our strong commodities. And that then calls for people, because I can see the general feel in South Africa is that people are demotivated. People are tired of politicians. People are tired of public representatives. But there is no other way than to hold us accountable. We have been elected into power, into spaces of advocacy and legislation, so that we can be able to be held accountable. We are available on social media platforms. Send us all of your grievances, all of your issues, even if it's as simple as asking a member of parliament, what is my load shedding schedule for today? You must absolutely do that. It is within your right to do that, because if you do not keep us accountable, then we just walk away scot-free with no accountability in our boat. We need to be able to be held accountable. All political figures need to be held accountable, and abuse the process of actually contacting your public representatives, because they are there to represent your interests. So that is the most solid advice that I can give South Africans at this point in time, and everybody that is listening right now, because together we can be able to move over towards stability. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think those are some wonderful closing points. So if you don't know who your MP is, or you don't know who your ward councillor is, go and find out today and engage with them. I think that is such an important closing point. Thank you. Are there any other further closing comments from the panel?
Thanks. Now, from my side as a co-host, I'd say, as if Michelle doesn't have anything to say. I would also like to echo your sentiments, Alison, to thank our panelists for this wonderful discussion and their time, and also to reaffirm the new kid on the block, the Regenesis Law School's role in a new type of law school that is practical, that is in touch with the real issues and all the stakeholders. It is just by way of clarification, our LLB is fully accredited by the Council on Higher Education and the South African Qualifications Authority, and has been fully recognized by the Legal Practice Council as a degree that meets the ambit of Section 26 of the Legal Practice Act. So it's all systems go. We are really, and of course, we are benefiting from knowing what has gone wrong in other law schools to try and create a cutting edge program. We have students at all levels. We've got members of parliament currently as students. We have major role players in the private sector, and certainly we hope that we will be taking some of our graduates to Worksmans when people do graduate time. So we really are quite excited to deliver this new product to the market. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And yes, we are hoping to be transformative and revolutionary in how we teach law. And we hope that you've gained some valuable insight from this webinar today. Please do stay up to date with our social media pages, including our LinkedIn page. That's Regenesis Business School. We will be posting our webinar links up there every 2 weeks. And please join us for these specific burning topics that we'll discuss with our wonderful panelists. We hope that you've learned a lot today, an actual question. And we look forward to engaging with you in the future. And if you're watching this right now and you feel that you would like to come on as a panelist, please do send us an email as well. We'd love to have you here and we'd love to hear your thoughts on our topics. Thank you to my panel who's joined us today. It was wonderful to have your time. We understand that for lawyers, time is money. So we do appreciate you giving us your time today. And for all of our attendees who joined, we appreciate you joining us online as well. Thank you once again and have a great day further. Bye-bye.